Good afternoon. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm a professor of political science and director of the Center for European Studies here at Pitt. Welcome to this month's conversation on Europe, which is part of our Year of Memory and Politics series and focuses on borders and contested memory in Northern Ireland. Unlike our usual conversations, today's roundtable is being conducted entirely virtually given the current situation. And I will apologize in advance if we have any technical difficulties, but I think we've worked out all the kinks, so this should run smoothly. I'm happy that we have over 100 people that have registered for this event, and that's wonderful to see. We're going to run Q&A differently today, unlike our normal conversations where you can feel free to ask a question if you're joining us live, or you can turn on your audio. We're going to ask everyone to keep their audio and videos off, and if you have questions, to just use the chat function on BlueJeans, and I will try to get to as many of the questions as I can. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center and the University Center for International Studies. Our co-sponsors are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech. Thank you to my colleagues Alison Delnor and Iris Matijevich for their help in organizing today's event and working to transition the roundtable to an entirely virtual event. So now we'll get started. Northern Ireland is synonymous with borders, primarily the borders that divide Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, with the Republic of Ireland. In the recent Brexit debates and negotiations, this border played a large role as it would become the border between the EU and the UK. But there are many other borders that exist in the context of Northern Ireland, as well as in the Republic. Some of the borders are physical, others are more centered around identity. But the physical and the non-physical borders typically reinforce each other. Not only are many of these borders themselves contested, but so is the memory that informs them. It is with this that we turn to our panel of experts. And I'm very pleased to be joined by four experts today. First, we have Jennifer Keating, who is the Assistant Dean for Educational Initiatives in the Dietrich College at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where she also teaches in the Department of English. She received her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. Her research interests include representations of colonialism, nationalism, and gender relations in 19th century British literature and 20th century Anglophone literature, primarily in Ireland and parts of the Caribbean. Her work also focuses on memoir, legacies of violence, and identity formation in societies in strife. Her book, Language, Identity, and Liberation in Contemporary Irish Literature, was awarded the Michael Durkin Prize for Best Book on Irish Language and Culture by the American Conference for Irish Studies in 2011. Her current research project, Performing Peace in the North of Ireland, focuses on the concept of performance in the ongoing peace process in Northern Ireland. So welcome, Jen. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Jonathan Blake, who is an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He received his PhD from Columbia University. His research interests include ethnicity, nationalism and religion, conflict and post-conflict societies, social movements and collective political mobilization, forced migration, and transnational criminal networks. Prior to joining RAND, he was a visiting fellow at the Columbia Global Policy Initiative, research director of the Toomer Foundation's Global Policy Conference, the Congress of Vienna 2015, and a consultant to the UN Development Program in Liberia and the International Rescue Committee in Sierra Leone. His first book, Contentious Rituals, Parading the Nation in Northern Ireland, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Connell Parr, who is a lecturer or assistant professor in the Department of History at Northumbria University in the UK. He received his PhD from Queen's University, Belfast. He works on Ulster Protestant politics and culture. His book, Inventing the Myth, Political Passions and the Ulster Protestant Imagination, was published by Oxford in 2017. His current research explores how states such as South Africa, Spain, and Chile, among others, deal with a divided and violent past through their arts and culture. Welcome. And finally, last but not least, we have Katie Hayward, who is a reader or associate professor in sociology at Queen's University Belfast and a senior fellow of the UK and a Changing Europe initiative. She received her PhD from University College Dublin. Her work focuses on the Northern Ireland-Irish border, the impact of the EU on the Irish border and the peace process, and Brexit. Among her publications are Dynamics of Political Change in Ireland and a recent report titled Bordering on Brexit, Views from Local Communities in the Central Border Region of Ireland, Northern Ireland. She's currently the lead partner for the Irish case study of the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities funded project Borders and Globalization. So welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us today. I thought we would start out by a question just to get us all sort of thinking about borders and talking about them. And so I thought I would run through all of you and give you a chance to talk a bit about this concept of borders, where do we see them, and perhaps also how the conception of borders has changed since the Good Friday or the Belfast Agreement. So Katie, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much, JJ, and hello everybody. I think, so just to get one thing out to begin with, I mean, the Good Friday Belfast Agreement of 1998 is seen by many as sort of transforming the situation on the island of Ireland in reducing of the border. Sorry, I've just got a lot of feedback there. Is that me okay?
Let's see.
Sorry, I can talk. It's not now.
So, is it okay? We can have everyone turn off their mics. If we want to try that for the panelists, actually, to turn off your mics, and then when you speak, we can turn them back on again. That may reduce some of the feedback. Okay, Katie, why don't you try?
Okay, yeah. So the Good Friday Agreement actually, of course, approaches the conflict in Northern Ireland as being really all about the border in many ways. So it's about the border as a point of political contention within Northern Ireland, so between nationalists and unionists. Nationalists not wanting the border to exist at all. Unionists, of course, wanting the border to be there so that Northern Ireland can continue to be part of the UK. The Good Friday Agreement also approaches the border in Northern Ireland on an all-island basis, so transforming relations on the island of Ireland in very practical ways, primarily through a North-South ministerial council where ministers and the governments from the South and from Northern Ireland can cooperate on practical matters relating to, for example, health and agriculture. And then it also approaches the border in terms of the state line between Ireland and the UK, in that it enables formal cooperation between Britain and Ireland at the very highest levels and between the various governments that exist across these islands, including Wales and Scotland, for example. So in many ways, at the same time as trying to reduce the contentious nature of the border, the Good Friday Agreement also puts it right there at the core of dealing with it. And so I think that's possibly something we should bear in mind when we try and understand why it is that people have felt quite so unsettled by the whole Brexit process, is that actually the border, although it became depoliticized, never actually completely went away as a point of difference and distinction within Northern Ireland and between these islands.
Great, thank you. Connell, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept you brought together today, because what it's to do with is to do with how we think about borders. I quite liked how the traditional border, which has dominated everything in terms of how we think about Ireland and Northern Ireland, politics, culture, socially, is that essential border between Unionists and Nationalists, between the Republic and between Northern Ireland. And it's to some degree, it's slightly unfortunate that has completely obliterated all the other borders that we know exist, in terms of borders between generation, borders between in terms of gender, and also, above all, some of us believe in the biggest of all, in terms of class. And it's a great shame in some ways that process has occurred, and in some ways it forces us to have to deal with it, and we acknowledge the kind of sectarianism, if you like, and the political predominance of that border at the expense of those other borders. So I think that it's also worth making a distinction between, and perhaps you'll go on to talk about this a bit more later, but between the ways in which I think that there are different parts of society in Northern Ireland which are interacting with these borders. And the way I see it is there's a sort of culture arts sector, there's a community sector, which is very important, and there can be an educational sector, and there's a political sector. And the political sector is the one which most people know about and which they discuss. And again, I think that to some degree that's a greatly dysfunctional and in some ways broken system. It doesn't work very well. And it's only just resumed in January 2020, the Stormont devolved assembly. And in some, it's a case of till the next time that collapses, till the next time there's some kind of perennial instability around it. And actually, in Northern Ireland itself, there's a lot of progress and movement which occurs in those other areas that I described, the culture arts sector, the community sector. And in some ways, that's where the real peace processes occur.
Great, thank you. And we'll definitely get back to talking about the arts and culture sector. I was wondering, Connell, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on some of these other borders that you briefly mentioned earlier? I know your own work is on class. We can also talk about gender, generation. If you could talk briefly, perhaps, where we're seeing kind of those groups, those borders within those groups.
Absolutely. And I think the thing is that the way that people even talk about the Troubles, they forget that it's actually in some ways a class conflict, in the sense of the vast majority of people who do the fighting and dying, as it were, in the Troubles are working class. And they kind of get the scapegoat, and they become made the scapegoat. They get the blame for it, when in actual fact, in many ways, it was the kind of the more middle class elitist view of Northern Irish society which had created the problem in the first place. And again, I do think it's very interesting, and there are other people who can speak to this on your panel as well. But in terms of the way in which, for instance, sometimes in terms of Ulster loyalism, there are even political developments there. There are kind of cultural initiatives there which people sometimes don't discuss, which are occurring on the ground in Northern Ireland, and people forget that, or they ignore, or they choose to ignore it, or whatever, for whatever reason, it's not highlighted in contemporary discourse. So I think that, it's very interesting and very important that we kind of put class and those other borders back into debates, and we try and again, articulate and highlight those.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, do you want to jump in and give your thoughts on this broader sense, this idea of borders as we see it? I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
I guess just to talk briefly about borders and the relationship with contested memory broadly, and to kind of, I guess, say that there are really two ways that I've been thinking about this since you invited us here, is that there's the role of memory in reinforcing borders, both physical and social borders, and what that means, and the way in which people remember, for example, the physical border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and those who remember or share collective memories of what it was like during the Troubles, when it was obviously a much more fortified border, and how that impacts what people might think it might become now, kind of under the new Brexit legal regime. And then secondly, so that's how memory informs borders, and then secondly, it's the borders between the memories that as I'm sure will come out a lot. The different communities in Northern Ireland hold on to different visions of history, and that informs their politics, their society, social relations, I think, quite a lot. So what people remember, how they remember it, who was the villain, who were the heroes, really reinforces the social boundaries, and so really I think there's a two-way street between borders and memory that I think we'll have a lot to talk about today.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. Jen.
Yeah, I think the two strands that I have been most interested in the last probably 5 to 7 years is the notion of contested narrative, the various genres of narrative, and the ways in which narratives are shaped by virtue of the genre or medium in which information is flowing, shared across borders, but also the ways in which communities are trying to articulate and solidify their own narrative, and how that is then in dialogue or pressed against by the counter narratives. And this can be certainly up and down across the border, Republic versus the North, but it's also, of course, that individual expression of identity and the ways in which those narratives circulate in efforts associated with reconciliation, but even the concept that there was actually something there to reconcile to begin with. That notion of a hybrid integrated society, I think, is something that is oftentimes gestured towards, rather than actually being able to point to very real dynamic examples of that. Within our context for our conversation today, we're focused on memory, but one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot also is the role of technology. So the ways in which technological solutions, so to speak, for the reinstitution of a border is something that came up quite a lot, and it was described oftentimes in magical terms rather than actually focusing on real state-of-the-art technology that could be used to mark a border that would not make it a target in the ways that it was when it was a militarized hard border. But when we really start thinking about the evolution of technology and the ways in which people have developed their relationships to those systems, the stratification of power and the negotiation of power within those relationships, when we're thinking about a poem like Kieran Carson's Intelligence from the mid-'80s, that is really starting to document the features of technological tools within the military paradigm during the Troubles. I think that's another feature that is worthwhile thinking about. The memories and the vestiges of very crude forms of technology, like the outposts that Rita Duffy paints, but also the ways in which very sophisticated surveillance systems really did superimpose and calcify those notions of divisions and borders between particular neighborhoods. The number of peace lines and peace walls, waste grounds that separate historically contentious neighborhoods throughout Belfast and in Derry as well are another example. But that notion in which those physical technological manifestations also compound class lines within many of the urban spheres, I think, is something worthwhile touching on as well.
Great. Hold on. Oh, I'm unmuted now. Sorry. Well, thank you all. I think that was a really nice way of sort of introducing the various ways that we were thinking about this and putting this panel together. And I think the different conceptions from the sort of physical nature of the border, the big border that we often I think most people think about, but then all of these other borders when it comes to whether it's generation, class, identity, as well as the contested nature of these borders and of the memory of them, as you've brought up as well. I think that was a nice segue into what I wanted to now go and talk through some of the points that you all have raised, and I think that'll give you more of an opportunity to talk about some of your own work in these various areas too. So to circle back to Katie and talk, and I know you've been doing and obviously thinking a lot about Brexit, of course, and so to think about to get back to Brexit and the role of the border in Brexit as well. But before we do that, I thought we could to start with thinking about what the role of the EU more generally has been in the peace process on the Irish border, which I think will give us a sense of that of why this border, the issue of the border in the Brexit negotiations, the ongoing debates as we're working things out, is such a salient and point. So if you maybe want to start us back with kind of where the EU fits into this.
Thanks, JJ. Yeah, so I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the Irish border has taken on different forms since its beginning. So it has been a customs border in the past. It has, as has been referred to, been quite a fortified border in some ways, and certainly that lives on in people's memories. So essentially what the European Union is all about is about transcending borders, so primarily in relation to the creation of the single market, which means freedom of movement of people, goods, services and capital across borders between member states. I mean, that's fundamentally what the EU is about. That's why it's called European integration. that's why some people so oppose European integration, because it does mean reducing borders in many ways. And what I found very interesting as worth noting is that the person who was representing the UK government, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland at the time in 2016, Theresa Villiers, made a speech in Derry City where she referred to the fact that, or she said that there has never been a hard border on the island of Ireland. Which was quite surprising for many people, given that the last vestiges of military watchtowers were removed not even about 10 years beforehand. So the sense of what we have today having been very much the norm and become sort of accepted as the norm was there at the very highest levels. And that's definitely true on the ground as well. And what I found in my research in the Central Border region, which began in the early 2000s and then has been revived in more recent years, is about the way in which people respond to European integration. And essentially what we found is that people associate, if you like, the benefits or the consequences of European integration with the peace process. And that's primarily because until you had the Good Friday Agreement and those various layers of cooperation that I mentioned before, until you had that, you couldn't fully experience or benefit from what EU integration was meant to mean on the island of Ireland. And so when people basically considered the open border in the border region, both sides of the border, they associated the open border with the Good Friday Agreement and with the peace process. And this is why you immediately have concerns in the border region and further afield that if Northern Ireland has been taken out of the EU, as it has, that this means a harder border and therefore almost inevitably a threat to the peace process. So the sort of the cooperation that's facilitated in very practical ways through the EU as a body that enables integration across state borders. This means something very particular on the island of Ireland, and as I say, it's very much seen as going hand in hand with the peace process itself.
And I wonder if you could talk a bit as well about the recent elections in Ireland, in the Republic, as well as in the UK, and sort of reflect on the continued, obviously, Brexit continuing to be an issue, as well as the role of the issue of the border that really still was very prominent in the elections in both places in the last few months.
Yes, so it's almost easier to talk about. So the election in the south there earlier this year, the Irish government sought to make it pretty much all about Brexit because they see themselves to have played a blinder on Brexit, essentially, that they got what they hoped for from the Brexit process, which of course they were opposed to principally, but they wanted to avoid a hard Irish border, and that's the outcome. Unfortunately for them, Brexit is very far down the list of priorities for most people in the south, partly because they were reassured by the withdrawal agreement, by what the outcome of Brexit at that point was, and therefore it just was not of immediate concern to many people. They were concerned with other things, housing and, for example, and health. So it wasn't really a Brexit-focused election in the south, and the success of Sinn Féin in that election doesn't really reflect necessarily a growing sense of Irish nationalism in response to Brexit. In the north, it was very different. So we had a general election in the UK in December, and in the north, that really was an election about Brexit. And there were electoral pacts between pro-Remain parties. And they were very successful in many ways in that the majority of parties who were returned are pro-Remain parties, those who are opposed to Brexit. Of course, the problem is for Northern Ireland, there is no Remain option. Northern Ireland is outside of the EU now. So we have an interesting situation in which those who are representing Northern Ireland in Westminster are having to navigate the consequences of Brexit at the same time as having been so openly opposed to it. And there are interesting political dynamics working out from that. Primary among them being the fact that Northern Ireland has to accept it has a very, very limited amount of influence in Westminster now.
I'm still sorry. I realize I'm muted. Thank you very much. Just a reminder, as everyone is listening, feel free to type in any questions or comments into the chat bubble as you think of them. So you don't need to wait till the end. But obviously, as things come up, feel free to add any questions or thoughts. So thank you, Katie. I think that gives us kind of a sense of the bigger border and the role of the EU, as well as how this is an ongoing, obviously an ongoing concern, and something that perhaps we can get back to later is the question of a united Ireland. Right? This is, I think, of course, something that is being discussed by many on different sides and means different things, and perhaps bringing together interesting coalitions of individuals on both sides of this. So I think that we can get back to that. I want to move on a bit and get return to some of the other borders that you all discussed in your opening comments, and some of these different places where these interfaces where we're seeing these things. Jonathan, I want to perhaps turn to you, and I hope you could talk a bit about the research that you've done on Protestant parades, and which you use the term in the title of the book is contentious rituals. And so to me, that very much makes it clear that we're obviously seeing, of course, the interface of Unionists and Nationalist Protestants and Catholics through these parades, that they are contentious. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that, and then thinking about this in relation to the borders and memory that you've brought up as well.
Yeah, so I think it's we can think about it in the same framework that I laid out before, of memory going both ways, or the relationship between borders and memories go both ways. That memory reinforces borders, and borders formed in the memory. So in my book, Contentious Rituals, it's primarily a study of mass mobilization into it's an Orange Order and band parades in Northern Ireland. So it's looking at kind of why it is that people kind of just, I guess ordinary folks decide to spend their free time taking part in parades. So the term, I think, contentious ritual here is very relevant, as you point out. So by contentious rituals, I mean specifically symbolic action, so rituals that make some sort of contested political claim, and they're actively opposed by others in the society. So it actually, for those who are familiar with parading in Northern Ireland, it's actually a bit of a pun, because contentious is the word that's used there to refer to the most contested, most disputed parades, the one that actually tend to cross boundaries and borders between Protestant neighborhoods and go into or near Catholic neighborhoods. But I use the term actually a bit more broadly, in a bit more of a sociological meaning, to mean about claim making. So for me, all of them are contentious, not just the ones that are called contentious in Northern Ireland. But these are, I think, a primary place where debates about both borders and memory take place in Northern Ireland, right? So one is, as I just mentioned, right, there's a continual discussion about the places where these parades go, because they're, basically the debate is that for the most part, the organizations that do these parades, claim that they have a civil right to be able to basically, make free speech anywhere they want in a democratic society, and on the other side, you have people who say, that we find these to be extremely offensive and provocative, and we don't want them going near our homes, near our schools, near our churches. So anyway, so that's kind of, I guess, the border, the actual physical border, right? The relationship between space and these things. But the deeper debate is really about contested memory, because it's not just that these parades are, I don't know, they have meaning, right? And the meaning is in a large part, I would say, rooted in memory. So on the very basic level, many of these parades are commemorative. They are explicitly commemorating historical events, and the way that they do that, of course, is from a particular point of view. So they're celebrating essentially either military victories or other kind of large, mainly military, but not exclusively, events from a Protestant loyalist point of view, where there are heroes and there are villains, and ours are the heroes and yours are the villains. So they're literally taking these memories and parading them down the street through all sorts of symbolism in terms of the uniforms they wear, the banners that they hold, the music they play, and so through their bodies they're kind of taking this memory onto the street. So that's I guess really why it is that or one of the issues that makes them so contested, and why it is that people don't want those memories or those memories that from a particular perspective kind of being paraded through their community. The broader point is that they then also help reinforce these borders between both physically and socially by constantly reminding people of these histories, by putting these contested histories, remembering the battles of the late 17th century, and remembering them in a particular way with a particular narrative. They're constantly reminding people, that this is, that there are two sides, and that our side won, or however you want to say it. So they're a way that kind of through both everyday processes, but all kind of these big, monumental events that take place throughout the year, they're ways of reinforcing the social and physical boundaries between communities.
Thank you. I wonder, Jonathan, if you might touch on, and Connell, this also feel free to jump in on this as well, but what the role of class plays in these parades, at the interface between sort of Protestants and Catholics, et cetera, and if you've seen that is playing a role in sort of heightening the sort of contested, the contested nature of these parades.
Yeah. So they are primarily a working class phenomenon today. That's not always been the case. There's been ebbs and flows of kind of the presence of middle class unionists, Protestants in these things. But today, both the loyal orders and especially the marching bands are really community organizations in working class Protestant communities. And so that's another border, right? That even within the Protestant community, many middle class Protestants look down on parades, think that they're totally sectarian, totally irresponsible. They're less likely to take place in middle class neighborhoods. They physically take place in working class neighborhoods, which is of course tend to be what are called interface communities, right? That they that Protestant working class Catholic neighborhoods that really come up on each other, that often have a physical border in the form of some sort of wall or physical separator between them. So these really conflicted ones take place in working class communities, and the ones that take place in middle class communities tend to be, though I would argue they're still contentious because they're still making a political claim about the role of, that Northern Ireland should remain in the Union with Britain. They're not contested in the same ways that you're not going to see protesters or people opposed them, in large part because of geographic segregation, that you're less likely to have I guess communities that would oppose them in middle class neighborhoods. But yeah, Connell, if you have some thoughts here.
Yeah, thank you. Connell, do you want to jump in on that?
Very much so. Yeah, I firstly, I would say that I think I completely agree that it's become a working class. It's regarded as a working class phenomenon, and it's interesting that historically there are a lot of tensions between Orangism, the Orange Order, and loyalist paramilitaries. There were some instances where they used to team up during the Troubles. But what's interesting is that nowadays it's a measure of the society that even a term like PUL, Protestant, Unionist, and Loyalist, comes into being, and in some ways homogenizes what are very different things in lots of ways. And it's kind of striking that there is this kind of association now between loyalism and the Orange Order and working class identity in Northern Ireland. And I think we have to stay in touch with that. And I think that Jonathan's absolutely right that there's a kind of sneering, dismissive regard, often from other Protestants, I might add, but also again that critical class border, that there is actually, it's a kind of working class hatred sometimes that gets expressed towards these groups. People mock how people speak in Northern Ireland. They mock people's accents, and it's a sort of again, it comes out from a sneering, a humour which borders on a real hostility to that group, and I find that, I have to say, very unfortunate and a bit dangerous in some ways. I think we have to stay in touch with those groups. We have to find ways of engaging with them, and even though that they are contentious and that there are difficulties, there has to be some way, and I think a lot of people are trying to find ways to keep the positive things that can also exist around it. And again, Jonathan would be truly the expert on this in terms of the discipline, for instance, or the camaraderie that it gives young men in Protestant working class communities in Northern Ireland. That culture gives them, and that we find some way to maintain that, and that we also see that there are positives and that there are ways in which that can keep going, especially with a group which has problems in terms of educational underachievement and attainment levels. I remember when I was living in Northern Ireland at the time, there was a peace monitoring report that came out in 2014, which Paul Nolan authored, which said that the Protestant working class males were at the bottom of the educational underachievement tables, just above Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller community, I think. So there's a massive difficulty there, which we frankly have to address.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there seems to be quite a bit of discussion on the chat about these parades. So and everyone can see this. So if you want to see the running discussion, I actually want to circle back to an earlier question. And this, I think, primarily for Katie, although anyone, of course, can jump in. So I'll just read this, although everyone can also, I think, look at the chat as well. And so the question is if the SDLP and Alliance continue the momentum into the future after the 2019 UK elections. Clearly, voters were not happy with the suspension of Stormont for 3 years, and both Sinn Féin and DUP lost some votes. Is the portion of the population that is, quote, Northern Irish versus Irish or British starting to vote and mobilize a bit due to Brexit, 3 years of suspension of Stormont? He says, I guess my question is, are the non-sectarian populations, which seem to be growing as a percentage of the population in the latest Life and Time survey, growing in importance? So I think, sort of the focus on sort of the non-sectarian populations and parties that are crossing over groups as well. So Katie, do you want to?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, in part because the rise of the centre ground in Northern Ireland in the December 2019 election contrasted so distinctly with what we saw in Great Britain in the same election, which was definitely not about an emerging centre ground. And it is funnily, it is a funny thing to sort of observe the fact that as British politics have become so divisive and hostile over the Brexit question, there is an emerging centre ground in Northern Ireland. The question is, what is that based on? And I think we need to be very careful that we don't overlay various things on top of that phenomenon. It's not necessarily the case, for example, that it's people who think of themselves as Northern Irish rather than British or Irish. And your question is quite right in that they did take votes from people who are traditionally voting for the SDL, for Sinn Féin or voting for the DUP, so they come from different backgrounds. Primarily, that vote, as I said before, was about Brexit, partly arising from frustration with the fact that the pro-Remain voice in Northern Ireland hadn't been represented in Westminster. Many people say satisfactorily since 2017 general election. But also a sense of the DUP and Sinn Féin not having given leadership over those questions for Northern Ireland at a really critical point. Looking ahead, can we say that this will be sustained? So does it mean that this middle ground, that the SDLP Alliance Party, that will be something that will transform politics, if you like, in Northern Ireland? It's really too early to say. I mean, there was a small portion, a study from Pete Shirlow and John Tong and others in the University of Liverpool on that election, showed that that for some people it was the first time of voting, and we do know that many people who don't associate with Unionist or Nationalist, up to half of the population, according to Northern Ireland Life and Times, that they actually also quite fed up with politics in general, and they don't vote at all. So some of those were voting, but really it was votes that were coming from elsewhere. So whether that can be sustained, we don't know. And a big part of it was about the electoral pacts as well between the pro-Remain parties. What does pro-Remain look like when Remain isn't an option? It's a really interesting question, and I think we're at a really critical time in Northern Ireland where other issues in politics and common crises, of course, and common concerns are emerging, and a lot, I think, for the future of Northern Ireland politics depends on how that's handled. And to go back to a point made earlier as to whether consociationism, whether Stormont is seen as being sustainable in managing those kind of key concerns, real day-to-day concerns that people have, I mean, that'll be a big question. And whether the Alliance Party can be seen to be playing a role of leadership there, again, that'll be under a lot of scrutiny in the coming months.
Thank you. Something that I always find really interesting, and I wonder, Katie, and anyone else that wants to reflect on this as well, is that the fact that the school system is still largely divided. And please correct me if I'm wrong. And so most kids are being educated either, only with Catholics, only with Protestants. And so, how are we going to see this if we are sort of this continue, the sort of non-sectarian political movement grow, if we're still, from a sort of socialization perspective, that, the education system is still largely divided. So I wonder, what you think of, kind of your thoughts on that in terms of those, how those are kind of working against each other, perhaps, or if we are seeing changes in the education system as well, Katie, or if anyone else wants to jump in on that.
I'll say a little bit, and then obviously others may want to say. So yes, absolutely. I mean, only if a small portion of schools are officially integrated schools, so being careful to have both Catholic and Protestant children. So we're talking like 7% or so. And it is the case that when students come down to universities in Northern Ireland or elsewhere, that they're actually not used to being in classes that are mixed, if you like. But I think that's something that's worth considering. I mean, it's definitely significant. But again, this is where we have the need to distinguish between sort of denominational labels and then political ones as well. And certainly it's the case that many people from various different backgrounds feel disillusioned or cynical about politics in Northern Ireland because, partly as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, unionists and nationalists are given that sort of predominant place as being, the two communities, the true traditions that matter. Connell may want to come in on this, but primarily the key divide in Northern Ireland education isn't really necessarily Catholic Protestant. It's about what happens when children are 10 or 11, and the segregation of the system in that regard between sort of grammar schools and non-grammar schools. So which no doubt, although it's meant to be meritocratic, no doubt has a class dimension to it, and certainly perpetuates the situation in which children from poorer backgrounds, be they Catholic or Protestant, suffer disadvantage from an early age that's sort of perpetuated and then has long-term consequences.
Yeah, I think just following on from that, it's very interesting the way grammar schooling in Northern Ireland changes, in that it leads to this flowering of people in the late 60s who become the kind of civil rights leaders, people like Eamon McCann, Bernadette Devlin. And it's very interesting the way in which Katie is correct that in some ways now it's quite a barrier to social mobility then, in a way which it was playing a kind of reverse role. I think it's very interesting that there was a remarkable woman called May Blood, who's a community worker who founded the Shameful Women's Centre in the late 1980s in Northern Ireland. And as I was saying earlier, sometimes the developments in community work precede the political breakthroughs and developments that occur later on in the society. And what's interesting I remember seeing a talk May gave. He subsequently went into the House of Lords later, but he gave a fascinating talk where she was saying that she does a lot of work for integrated education, and she said that the people who she was most, who she had met, the bracket of people that she met who were most in favour of integrated education were former ex-prisoners, former paramilitaries, and it was the thing of, we don't want this for our children. So this group of people who are often slandered and marginalised or described as being how we reintegrate them, the society doesn't always want to reintegrate those people or deal with them after the conflict. We're actually the most progressive in terms of those views. And I think that that's something that, again, is very worth something that we have to pick up on, and is something which tells you a lot about, again, the class dimensions to that question. There are a lot of polls which exist, and they say that the majority of people in Northern Ireland want integrated schools. And then you talk to them and you say, where does your child go to school? And they say, well, they go to a Catholic school, or they go to a state school. And again, it tends to be middle class people who are they tick the box in the questionnaire or in the opinion poll which says, yes, we want integrated education. And it's a case of you put your money where your mouth is. And actually, the what people practice isn't always what they preach.
Can I just come in on that just very quickly?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, please come in. Sorry.
No, just to follow up on that, and that's primarily to sort of just bring this back to full circle. That's primarily because integrated schools aren't generally grammar schools, with some exceptions, but primarily they're not. So when it comes to children being getting to the age of 9, 10, then yes, parents are faced with the question of do they want their child to go to what's seen as a school that give them the best chances in education, or do they want the child to go to an integrated school? Many people don't have that choice because there are so few of them. And if they are integrated, then they tend not to be grammar schools. So this is where you have that perpetuation of division and a lack of, although people in principle may say, yes, integrated education makes a lot of sense, absolutely be a lovely thing. In practice, they feel as though that decision would be one that would be disadvantaging their child, which is that's a terrible situation to be in. But that sort of explains a little bit as to why we have this lack of push towards challenging that system.
Mm-hmm. Now that makes, I think that makes moving forward challenging, obviously, if the structure doesn't allow for that, even if people say they want it, but then in reality don't. But again, it's, moving things forward as well. So, Jen.
Yeah, I'm thinking also of the ways in which the suspension of the political system over the last several years and the ways in which that's truncated the prospect of continued governmental support for these efforts, or even a delegation of that responsibility more to the municipalities. That lack of a core central effort to push for those integrated schools to reach those expectations so that the families do have a viable option, I think is a huge issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I want to, we're getting lots of questions, which is great, and lots of discussions and links that people are sharing. So if not to distract the panelists, but we have a good question that I think actually circles back to some of the discussion about parades, but also sort of non-sectarianism. And so the question for Jonathan, perhaps to start, and then others, of course, to jump in, is the following. Person is wondering about the possibility of future parades commemorating non-sectarian historical events, i.e. moments of class solidarity across Catholics and Protestants. In doing so, parades could be opened up more as a carnival atmosphere, the attempted rebranding of Orange Fest, as an example, and the act of parading would be performing or drawing new, different, and more inclusive community borders. So that's an interesting idea. Jonathan, what do you think? What do you think of that?
Great, sure, that but it's just that, there are non-sectarian parades. The Belfast Pride Parade is now a major event. I'm trying to remember, was it bigger than the 12th this year, or maybe it was the Dublin Pride? One of them, I think, took over this last year in terms of number of people, the 12th of July. So there are these events that bring people together. Part of the problem is, I think, communities tend to be, own historical events, claim them as their own. One of the other comments I saw referencing John Evershed's work on the Somme here, I think is critically important on how the Loyalist community has claimed the mantle of bearing the brunt of the British efforts at the Battle of the Somme, when in fact there were Catholic nationalist brigades, divisions, whatever, fighting right alongside them, dying just next to them, but that for various political reasons was kind of erased in Irish memory at the same time that Loyalists kind of took and pushed their own narrative of sacrifice onto that. So part of the problem is that there just is it's not just in how things are commemorated, but that there is a division over how things are remembered. And the second point was just about the form of celebration of parades has become so ingrained as a Protestant thing. The number, I forget the exact numbers. I know there's something like 3,000 or 4,000 parades a year in Northern Ireland. 20, it's something like 80 or 90% of parades are Protestant. So it really is, as a form, is dominated by one side. That Catholics, even though there are both more, let's call them more or less political parades, some ranging from, things that are maybe a bit more open to anyone who wants, like St. Patrick's Day, to explicitly, parades commemorating the hunger strike or various moments in Republican history. It really is a mode of collective action that kind of has the Protestant stamp on them. So I would say if you want to kind of create some sort of cross-community event, parading may not be the type of event you want to have. Just because I think some people are just kind of turned in. There are a lot of parades already in Northern Ireland. I don't know if they need more.
Can I just jump in there and just suggest perhaps some people know what I'm going to say here, but the Great Parade for the Labour Movement, the May Day Parade. This is a class, if you like, a cross community parade that goes on, and again, those numbers were dwindling in recent years, as we know, for the left throughout Europe and the world globally, perhaps. But again, what's interesting about the current crisis, which we obviously haven't discussed as yet so much, is that we're seeing talk about the importance of what are key workers and about how you keep an economy going through labour. And perhaps that kind of working class identity kind of comes back into being. What I wanted to a quote I always remember from the late civil servant Maurice Hayes, who was a fascinating, very great man in some ways, who talked about, who wrote a lot and was involved in Northern Irish political developments at quite a key time. Maurice had a great quote where he talked about how there were a number, the nearest we could get to reconciliation, and this was discussed earlier in terms of how we think about those things, was what Maurice said was a variety of small individualized initiatives as communities might be the closest we can get to that. It's a very kind of realist way of looking at it, I think. And one thing that I remember going on in Belfast was 2014, there was in the Shameful Road Library a commemoration and a plaque which was put up for 7 members of the Shameful area who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. And what it was locating an historical episode and deciding to commemorate that rather than the traditional lines, the traditional, here's a nationalist commemoration, here's a unionist, here's a loyalist commemoration. Let's find another part of working class history in Belfast and commemorate that. And it was a very well attended event, and that plaque went up, and then there was a stained glass window, I think, in Belfast City Council, which was opened in 2016, which is a very, again, a bit of a cauldron of division in the past, the council. So there are different ways that those small individualized initiatives can occur and have occurred.
Thank you. No, I think it's very interesting, just thinking about sort of, as you both mentioned, sort of the role of parades in sort of the claim making and the memory making in Northern Ireland, and how they have been used or perhaps can be used in the future by different groups. I mean, I think the Pride Parade is a really interesting example, or, focusing on different aspects of these, cross-cutting cleavages that we're seeing, that being class, as Connell just mentioned. To shift the discussion, I'm sorry, my computer keeps beeping. I want to shift the discussion a bit to talk a bit more about sort of the arts and culture side of things. And Jen, to turn to you and to talk a bit about your own work and just more generally, and the role of literature, the role of performance in this ongoing peace process that we've been touching upon. I think you're muted. One sec. Is
that better?
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry, we have several people in the household on Zoom.
No.
So I keep having connectivity issues.
No, you're fine.
This isolation scenario playing out.
Yes.
So I think if we're looking back, as Katie started the conversation, really looking at the context of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 and the explicit decision not to emulate the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in another society emerging from conflict like South Africa. What that meant is that there was a vacuum for individuals to articulate their experiences of the Troubles and also make sense of those explorations, pushing against those very narrow constraints of unionist versus nationalist, Republican versus loyalist categories. And so I think that the arts, whether the visual arts, performative arts, theatrical work, and literary, allowed for a space really from at least the early 90s onwards to interrogate and explore those categories. to pick up on a couple of the themes that have already been present within the context of this conversation, especially thinking about class and this notion of location, authenticity associated with location. Two pieces that come to mind are Anne Devlin's short story, Naming the Names, and then a really recent novel, which I'm sure everybody has accessed, which is Milkman. You can see the smiles already going with the other panelists. But I do think that those are two useful points. Naming of the Names is a short story about a woman in working class West Belfast who is accused of informing, or she's basically arrested and asked to inform on Republican militants in the region. And then rather than naming the individuals who she's been charged to name, after seducing the son of a judge in the diplomatic system, she names all of the streets in West Belfast. And so the authentication of her role, her relationship to the location is actually associated with the urban mapping in West Belfast. And I think within naming the names, you have this refusal to get down to the particular details. But what you also have in Burns' Milkman is this notion of the claustrophobic feeling of the working class district, the notion of surveillance, whether it's from police, the military, or paramilitary, and the ways in which the protagonist in Milkman is also pushing against those really strict notions of gender role, right? And those kind of heteronormative dominant forces that are at play within her working class family, but also within the district, and the ways in which that movement is pushed with the role of her running through the city, running through the gardens and other parts of the landscape that allow her this momentary freedom, but then that needs to be stopped so that she doesn't become one of those members of the beyond the pale contingency. So I think when we're starting to think about the role of the arts, it's this place that I think allows for the political imagination to be captured and explored, but it's also a place where you have this wealth of perspectives and explorations that have just been going for decades now.
Great, thank you. Jen, I want to follow up actually. We have a question. Lots of discussion going on the side here. We have a question that gets to something you mentioned earlier. Oh, there it comes back, which is about technology. And given that we are using technology to try and eliminate borders here during our stay-at-home orders, the person wanted to know, actually, I think this is from Allison, more from you about sort of technology's role in removing borders. Obviously, we know about technology's role in building borders, but perhaps more getting back to this idea of what technology can do in the ongoing peace process and more generally in the context we're talking about.
Yeah, like so many people, about 2 weeks ago, I was actually supposed to take students to one of the innovation centers in Dublin to meet the founding researchers of one of the groups that's bringing together university researchers as well as industry researchers on developing AI. And I think when we're thinking about advancing technology as the prospect of the unifying force, it oftentimes then moves into this idea of connectivity in terms of globalization and international markets. I have lots of criticisms to offer within that space in terms of the ways in which it reinforces different forms of class division, reinforces concepts of hypernationalism. There are ways, however, in which it also does allow for the prospect of linking people, of pulling people together on these research enterprises, and then really thinking about the ways in which it can sometimes lead to leveraging of economic development across the border. It doesn't need to just be within the university sector, but really allows for Dublin, Belfast, and some of these other urban sectors, Cork, to come together and then continue to build relationships with other multinational groups throughout Europe, throughout the rest of the world. So that's one way in which we could start thinking about that.
Great, thank you. So Jen, related to what you've been talking about, and Connell, your work as well. So perhaps you can jump in on this as well. We have a question about how the performing, and I would ask also literary arts, have been used to explore reconciliation and build bonds across communities.
Yeah, so some of my work looks, firstly, I'd like to thank Jennifer for mentioning my ma and Evelyn there. It's a fantastic, sensational writer. Totally agree we should be doing something about her alone, but we'll come back to that another time. But the thing is that I think the thing I often find with theatre is that it's a place where it is a safe space where you can be apparently fictional. In an apparently fictional sense, you can explore something which is then mediated by performers. And therefore, it's one of those processes where people can watch a play, or it can also be people reading a novel. This is the way in which arts and culture interacts with this, I think, very well. You can get this kind of interesting process where there is that kind of change. Seamus Heaney had a great line about how, he was a bit more of a realist about that. He was involved in Field Day Theatre Company, and Heaney talks about how it remakes the audience in posterity, the rereading and the rewriting of history, if not in the stalls. And I think that was again a kind of typically insightful comment from him. Again, what I would emphasize is, and I mean, what I look at is, I was looking into that single identity aspect in terms of unionism, loyalism, and Protestantism. That again, the way which that group has been, the sort of working class Protestant group has been represented and is interpreted by many people quite negative. It presents it as a culture which is a bit Philistinic, as in lacking a culture beyond the parades and beyond Orangism, that it has a kind of narrow a reactionary identity. And I suppose what I was doing was looking at the way in which actually there was a very vibrant set of working class Protestant playwrights and authors who had come to the fore, and I could only look at in my book, I could only look at sort of 10 of them. There were actually a number more, and there are more emerging now, and thankfully more women emerging from more women writers coming along. And I think that what it was showing was again that there was movement, there was a quite a vibrant, rich culture. If you're talking about a Protestant culture, you had all of this sort of this raft of very interesting playwrights who reflected Protestant working class culture and its kind of divisions and its tensions far more representatively and successfully than many politicians would have you believe. So I think it's essential that we look towards that, and then you get into that stage where the change which occurs from people who view those plays and who view those artworks, they see that, and then they're changed. So it's not just the fact that the Protestant working class is doing things for themselves or they're presented in a certain way by themselves. It's also that people see the plays wherever they see them, whether they see them in community centres or established theatres, and they are also seeing a different version of the group.
Yeah, I'd like to echo some of that too, because when we're thinking about contemporary companies that are still in practice, Kibosh Theatre is one that comes to mind. I've had students come in contact quite a bit with Paula McFetridge, but I think if we're thinking about the notion of the audience and the prospect of compassion, empathy, and shifting a perspective that comes from that participation as an audience member, the theatrical arts are quite rich in that regard. One thing that I think is really important as well, which I think your research is touching on, is this notion of the historical artifact that comes through the scripts, because it allows us to continually revisit. Ideally, theater is performed, but what we can also do is start thinking about the historical record of exploration and interrogation that comes in the theatrical work, and really looking at the ways in which those scripts are oftentimes interrogating those evolving notions of identity that are nowhere near as calcified as we like to think of them as being when we're trying to stabilize those terms in doing our research. I think it's also really interesting to think about the way that location is signified and relationship to territory, relationship to particular places as a way to pluck that cord of authenticity comes through in a lot of these theatrical works as well. That's something that I've been really interested in mining a little bit in the work of a company like Kibosh, that really puts this emphasis on theatrical play within specific locations and really bringing the location to life within the performance. We have a similar group here in Pittsburgh that does that kind of work in alternative spaces as well.
Great, thank you. I want to return to a couple of questions that we've got a while ago. Let me just scroll down to them, and whoever wants to jump in on this, feel free to. But kind of getting back to the question of European identity, and sort of what's one of the participants talked about is the Europeanization of Northern Irish, the younger generations, through educational and research mobility through programs like Erasmus. And a more general question, how how this sort of compete, perhaps, is this a competing identity? Has the, sort of mobility of students across borders from, for example, the Republic to Northern Ireland, vice versa, to England, etc., as well as to, the continent, how that has created a larger European identity. Does this compete with some of the other identities that we've been talking about? And any changes that you've seen in recent years, paralleling other events that have happened? I think that captures sort of both of the sets of questions. So whoever would like to kind of jump in on that. Katie?
Yeah, just a couple of things on that. So one point to make is I've done some work on those who say they're neither unionist nor nationalist. Some detailed analysis with my colleague Carl McManus on the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey on that. And one thing that is very striking is that the fact that many of those who say they're neither unionist nor nationalist have had experience outside of Northern Ireland. So maybe they've worked away for some time, or maybe they've been on an Erasmus program, or some kind of experience of being outside of the place. I think that's kind of significant, and it's by far the greatest factor of commonality amongst those. That's not saying that by any means that all of them have had that experience, but it's definitely something that seems to be a factor in their identity as neither unionist nor nationalist. Mm-hmm. So we may think that that might have significance down the line. If those programs are closed off to people from Northern Ireland. And yes, more broadly, generally what we saw in relation to Brexit, and to sort of try and explain it a wee bit as to why it was quite so divisive in Northern Ireland, is that putting it very simply, the people from a nationalist background in Northern Ireland, or a nationalist perspective, tend to mirror or be very similar in thinking about the EU in the way that Ireland has as a whole traditionally. So the sort of the official government approach to European integration in the South has been that European identity complements Irish identity. In fact, it enhances it in many ways, and that there isn't a conflict between the two, but actually Europeanness is just a greater expression of Irishness in many ways, that national sovereignty in Ireland is expanded by European integration rather than constrained by it. And you see almost the reverse of that approach amongst the traditional unionist approach to European integration, which matches or mirrors in many ways the approach taken by the UK, in that European integration is a constraint on national identity. The Britishness is very distinct from European identity. In fact, it conflicts with it in some ways, or sits uncomfortably with it. And you definitely saw that approach going into the Brexit debates and discussion. And certainly it helps to sort of explain why it was, the whole Brexit debate was quite so divisive here. And therefore it's definitely not the case that European identity is seen as like an alternative identity that people from British and Irish backgrounds can feel comfortable in. It tends to be politicized and in ways that enhances divisions and distinctions rather than ameliorates them.
Mm-hmm. I'd argue along those lines, Katie, that it's seated in the deep history of the relationships between the countries as well. Been thinking a lot about the legacies of the Act of Union and the ways in which that legacy has been brought forward, even with just the repetitious rhetoric, like the Irish question circulating in Westminster. So I think some of these historical paradigms, the specters of these paradigms seem to be coming forward. And I think sometimes they're named intelligible and they're intact and can be interrogated really for their historical implication. And then other times they seem to be just kind of floating in the background, informing people's consciousness, whether it's actually grounded in the particular history or just a mythological understanding of that history as well. Because Joyce writes on this notion of a connectivity to Europe, right, and the ways in which he relies upon the Greek mythologies and French vocabulary from time to time, just to give those gestures of a linkage that's an alternative cosmopolitan identity that goes in the direction away from London, away from the notion of the Union. And that political connectivity seems to be something that's sought very much in Ireland, but also pushed against continually within the concept of the Union.
Absolutely, and it's also about the selectiveness of official memories as well. So, of course, British engagement with Europe hasn't always been conflictual. It's been very complementary in many ways, and the UK has played a really important role in European integration and the creation of the single market, etc. And yet that has been very selectively used and selectively remembered. And so it has been fascinating, I think, even thinking more broadly about memory and the way that it is manipulated at times of, in politically significant moments, that we see actually quite how short or how constrained official memories can be. Even to make a larger point, even with regards to British official sort of British memories about the Good Friday Agreement, and about how to refer back to Teresa Villiers' suggestion that there was never hard border on the island of Ireland, that actually memory is quite short because of the apparent lack of significance of Northern Ireland for the UK identity as a whole.
It would probably be quite interesting, wouldn't it, to look at that period when the Democratic Unionist Party from June 2017 to December 2019 had that unprecedented kind of balance of power situation. And it was very interesting, I thought, the way in which that was kind of reported in the British press, that it was the Irish MPs, and there were cartoons which appeared, which conjured up the old sort of Jack Troubles cartoons, which had a weird anti-Irish kind of dimension to them, where there would be again the ignorance of the DUP, that they would be presented with barrels of Guinness around them because the well-known anti-temperance DUP positions coming through. And it's probably be an interesting case study for anyone wanting to look back on that period and see the ways in which those representations occurred.
Yeah.
So we're quickly running out of time, which is it's such a fascinating topic. We could obviously continue all afternoon, which we won't, don't worry. But Connell, I wanted to ask you one question, and then I want to wrap up and have some thoughts from everyone. I know you're working now on looking at how different countries are that have had a divided, a more violent past, are dealing with this through arts, through culture. And I just wonder I know you're working on it right now, but in terms of what you found and what you think, other countries, South Africa, Spain, Chile, can learn from the Northern Irish experiment, excuse me. Maybe it is an experiment. The experience, Freudian slip, the experience that we've been talking about in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I think the answer to that, JJ, is that, to be honest with you, politically, I'm not sure a great amount, in the sense of it hasn't, it doesn't completely work. There can be things that we can do, but I think that's not been a terribly successful. We know it's imported anyway from continental Europe, the kind of d'Hondt structures. And, when the British and Irish governments get round to fixing them, all well and good. And if not, there are other more important things to be dealing with. What I think, it was touched on a point which was raised earlier about truth commissions. Now, the Truth Commission and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is often the thing which is mentioned that Northern Ireland should have a version of. And I think that probably should, but we all kind of agree that the local unionist and nationalist parties wouldn't make that work very well. And then in any case, unionist parties tend to be against the concept. And the British and Irish governments also probably wouldn't engage with that as they should. So we kind of probably have to park that and say it's desirable but unlikely. What we actually have, which is inadequate in Northern Ireland, is a kind of Spanish Pacto del Olvido, except the worst parts of the Pacto del Olvido, which is the Pact of Forgetfulness, where you leave it to the historians, you leave it to the academics to argue out and write books about, and we do that. I think everyone involved here and in other scholars do that. But we don't get even the forgetfulness. We don't get the positive aspects of the Pacto del Olvido. We get the worst parts. We get it being a part of present political dispute. So my suggestion is that there's not very much that we can actually learn from it, and we kind of have to leave it there, and we have to say it's over there, that broken political system, and maybe at times it'll work and other times it won't. It'll just about keep going for the time being, perhaps. But actually it doesn't really work. And then there are other areas of the society in which we have to look to, where there is some kind of an unofficial, not Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but there is movement. Again, there is dialogue, there is forward progress. And I think, that's again, again, for instance, in South Africa, the TRC is regarded as the drawing of the line under the past, which is a very symbolic moment, which is very useful. But actually it comes a time when there are other problems in that the society has been deeply traumatized. So though the South African government can say, excuse me, we've done that, we draw a line under that, and we have other problems to deal with, there is also the sense in which there are other deeply traumatic legacies which the whole society is dealing with. And again, it occurs through other means. It occurs through culture and the arts, it occurs through community work, it occurs through academia, and there are other ways in which that can be explored.
Great, thank you. So we are nearing, it is getting close to 1:30 here on the East Coast in the U.S. So what I thought we would do are sort of a couple of concluding questions, and I'll pose both of them. And if we want to kind of do a last round, and feel free to answer whichever of these or both if you want, briefly. So the first question is thinking about the current situation, not the current one that we're all sitting at home because of, but if we think about sort of Brexit, and there was a lot of talk about the potential for renewed violence and conflict because of Brexit, and I wanted to hear what your thoughts are on that. So that's the first question, and the second is something I alluded to earlier on, which is, are we going to see a referendum on a united Ireland? And what would that even look like? I know there's been a lot of discussion about that. So we may not have time for everyone to answer both of those, but if you want to jump in on either of those as we conclude, I think that would be great. Jonathan, I can't see you. I assume you're still there. So if you perhaps want to start.
I'm here. Can you see me now if I'm talking?
I can. For some reason, I cannot see you. I'm told you're there. So I'll let Allison and them work on finding you. But if you want to just start talking, hopefully you'll pop up.
Yeah. So I guess on the Irish unification question, not in the immediate future. I do think that it raises the likelihood in the medium long to long term future. I guess kind of depending on how things shake out, but it's not like there's going to be anything tomorrow. Public opinion shows that, and I just don't think it's good. People are waiting to see what happens. On violence, I hope not. If there is, my expectation would be low level. I don't foresee mass mobilization into violence, but on the other hand, what the last couple of weeks have shown us, have reminded us, and those of us who have kind of thought, and actually one of the things I've been thinking about a lot in the last couple of weeks is those first early days and weeks of the troubles in the summer of '68 and stuff like that is just how quickly society can change. That things are extremely fragile. I don't mean Northern Ireland. I mean, society's life. Is extremely fragile, and things can, like that shift radically. So who knows? I mean, maybe as a last note, I would say, maybe that also, that there's the possibility that things can shift radically quickly for the better. We don't have to only be dark here. So that's what I would say.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jen, do you want to jump in?
I think that there will be a border poll sometime probably within the next, let's say, 18 months or so. But I think the circumstances associated with the coronavirus and the economic implications for this, the prospect of significant unemployment, and I also think some of the tension between even the public health reactions in the North versus the Republic highlighted a lot of the difficulties of the border and the ways in which there isn't an integrated approach across the island of Ireland. So to summarize, I think the economic fallout of the current circumstances are going to have a lot of implications. And when there's economic duress, I think that especially in enclaves where there's very little material or there are uneven forms of economic duress through unemployment or lack of access to resources, the myriad of things that were part of the issues back in 1968 as well. It's going to be a bit of a powder keg, I think, for the coming months. And then the influence of the political reactions, I think, will have an outsized effect because of the fragility in the current moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Not a very uplifting thought, but yes, no,
Sorry,
thank you.
I'm
I think
a very
that
stunning person.
No. I think that, I think that gives us pause to realize, that the current situation, is very much reflected in, is laying on top of already what we've been discussing in some of those divisions as well. Katie.
There's some
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there's legacies over the last 10 years as well that have been pent up, and we haven't pulled peace for a very long time. So it's just a matter of really considering what the political climate is. Do we move towards solidarity? I think that's a very good prospect, but within the context of hyper-nationalism the world over right now, I guess my outlooks are not quite so sunny.
Okay, thank you. Katie, your thoughts on either of these or the current situation as well?
Yes. I mean, they're very, very just a couple of things. I mean, Jen was absolutely right. I mean, last week alone, there were 10,000 jobs lost in Northern Ireland, and that's a quarter of all the jobs that were lost during the financial crisis in 2007 onwards. So it's going to be absolutely dramatic, and we don't know what kind of landscape any of us are going to be moving into after this. And certainly there are huge pressures on Stormont, and I would say there are two things to bear in mind. So one is that a border poll doesn't have to be called unless it seems like there'll be a majority in favour of Irish unity. And the most reliable and rigorous surveys don't suggest we're anywhere near that yet. And one sort of analysis of the data sort of reveals that just as nationalists are responding to Brexit in ways that make them more strongly nationalist, think that Irish unity is going to happen and that they want it more. So unionists are responding in the opposite direction. So they're more likely to have stronger unionist sentiments and be more resistant to Irish unity, although they see it as being made more likely by Brexit. So we do have obviously potential for growing tensions on that one. In relation to violence, I mean, violence has never left Northern Ireland society, and even in the last few weeks, we've had death threats against Sinn Féin politicians from dissident Republicans. So the picture is very complicated, of course. And I think that the key question as to whether it leads into widespread violence and is really about whether it's legitimised or not, whether it's seen as being legitimate. And this is why it's imperative upon both the British and Irish governments and the EU more broadly to show that the democratic system works, the democratic politics works, and this is why it's imperative upon politicians within Northern Ireland to show that actually that Stormont can properly function and meet essential needs in Northern Ireland at this really critical time. So there's enormous pressure on the shoulders of politicians in Stormont right now. Primarily, it's about showing that, that achieving political ends by peaceful means is actually productive and is something that's worthwhile and worth the long haul, if you like.
Thank you. Connell, your thoughts?
Yes, I think that, interestingly, there is some relevance here to Sinn Féin's recent success in the elections in the Republic of Ireland last month, because there's something where, had Sinn Féin been in government, there would have been an extra push there, whether they would have been in the Department of Foreign Affairs and been able to perhaps have Mary Lou McDonald as Taoiseach or a foreign minister being able to relentlessly push a border poll, and the rest of the Irish establishment has kind of manoeuvred them out of that situation. But what you may deal with later is an even bigger Sinn Féin juggernaut if they don't get a handle on the issues of housing that were mentioned and healthcare mentioned earlier. I would be wary about suggesting that a border poll will be immediate, and as in the next few years, because, as Katie said, that it's very unlikely that those conditions exist, which only the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland can actually call that. It doesn't matter. Again, it's irrelevant what the local parties are talking about or discussing in public. And I mean, at the same time, there is something which I think we should all be aware of, that demographically in a couple of decades' time, it is sort of almost inevitable, and that therefore there has to be not preparation, but there has to be some kind of a dialogue which is preparing the groundwork for that, because whenever there is constitutional change in Ireland, it tends to be accompanied by quite a lot of serious violence, and not just the presence of violence that was mentioned earlier. And so those conversations have to occur. But at the same time, I think it's very interesting to me personally when you look at the Irish government, when it's what it's been dealing with, and the society has its own problems which have to be addressed, and the idea that there's going to be United Ireland's going to come in and suddenly fix that is it would seem to be a bit of a castles in the air moment. I think those changes need to occur down south first before that situation happens. But again, it's just a case of quiet preparation, if you like, towards that moment.
Mm-hmm.
You need to unmute yourself, JJ.
Thank you. Sorry. I was doing so well. Anyway, so I was saying, thank you all so much for all of your insights. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We could, of course, continue this, and there's a lot more to say. But I think we've touched on the political, the social, different kinds of borders, legacies, memories, and obviously this is a very a very important topic that touches on a lot of different areas. So thank you to everyone for your insights, and thank you to all of our participants, of which we've had lots of discussion. I think you've probably all noticed this going on the sidebar. What we will do in the coming weeks, this obviously is being recorded. This will be available on our website within the next 10 days or so, and you are all welcome to rewatch, use part of it in your classes, share with whomever you'd like. We will also be collecting additional reading materials and including that on the website as well. So all of your panelist publications will be listed, as well as some of the other novels and plays and things that have been mentioned in the conversation as well. So feel free to look at the website for further information as well. So with that, I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and thank you again to everyone, to our panelists and to participants for joining us.